Hi there, everybody. Steve, the amateur historian. How y'all doing today or tonight, whatever the time of the day is? I've got a new case I want to discuss here. One that I stumbled onto at least a few weeks back as of this recording. And it is, if you go onto the Doe Network online and you go under their Oregon cases, as far as women go, the oldest missing persons case they have listed there is the disappearance of 10-year-old Betty McCullough from the general vicinity of what today would probably be Silver Falls Park, which is several miles east of Salem, Oregon. This happened back in 1941, just a couple months before the U.S. dove into World War II, and it's a very bewildering story. And I have at least a possible theory as to what I think might have happened to her. I don't have any definitive proof that this is what happened, but considering where she was, the circumstances of her life, and the circumstances of a certain place located not too far from where she and her family were living, I think there might be something there. So join me as I discuss in this new Mystery Murders episode the 1941 disappearance of 10-year-old Betty McCullough. So it's June of 1941. Betty McCullough and her family, which is a fairly large family. I found pictures, like family photographs that were taken, obviously mostly disseminated online in relation to Betty McCullough's ultimate disappearance. And they were a fairly large family. There were several children, and they were a migrant family. They were migrant workers, so they kind of moved around from spot to spot depending on the time of the year so that they could find work. And under their circumstances at this time, they had recently relocated to the vicinity not too far from Silver Falls in Oregon from Colorado. And they were there for that summer to pick berries. That was their primary work they were going to be doing. It's not all too different from another disappearance that happened almost 2 decades later with a little girl named Alice Lee who disappeared little ways east of Eugene, Oregon. And she lived with her fairly large family, and their father did have a job, but due to the size of their family, it wasn't enough, so they would tend to travel and they would work, and I think when Alice disappeared, they were like in bean fields picking beans, and they would kind of do the same thing that the McCullough family was doing, which was, as a whole family, they would go out and work together. And in Alice Lee's case, that's what they were doing. And she was a little girl, so she kind of went off to play on her own. And she disappeared, and she was discovered dead just a short while later in a brutal, brutal murder. She'd been buried in a fairly shallow grave not too far from where she was last seen. But that was more of a situation where the family did have roots in that area, but would go out and work the fields together as a whole family. And that's what the McCullough family would also do. Now, in the case of Betty, it's been noted, and unfortunately it was the early 1940s, understanding of psychology, physical disabilities, mental disabilities, developmental disabilities were considerably less understood then, sometimes to the point of them not really knowing at all. And a lot of times kids would be misdiagnosed if they had something like autism, which pretty much unknown at that time, but it's not like it didn't exist. So, medical professionals might say, oh, well, your kid has this or that. And, a lot of people ended up in mental asylums for an assortment of different things. You could end up in a mental asylum for being an alcoholic. You could end up there for being too cheerful. You could end up in a mental asylum for being homosexual. There was it was just a different time and a very uninformed time in many circumstances. And that is unfortunate in this case because it makes it really difficult to understand Betty McCullough's situation. And the reason I mention that is because it seems clear based on the limited information we have, but also pictures taken of her and of her with her family. She clearly had a disability of some kind, and people have theorized what that might have been. But generally speaking, she was known to have reoccurring physical health issues. She took to illness very quickly, and reportedly she had been taken to a doctor who told the family that she probably didn't have a whole lot longer left to live. They predicted she'd be lucky to make it to 20. She would probably die in her late teens. Now, again, we don't know what circumstances this doctor used to make that prediction, but that was the understanding of that time. She was also deaf, and she was described as being mute, but it appears that she was able to a certain degree, communicate with her family. And of course, she grew up with them, she lived with them, she traveled with them. Even if she struggled communicating, the family would be able to see, living with her family for all that time, they would be able to understand what she was asking or what she wanted or what she was trying to communicate, even if she couldn't get the words out. Which, if a complete stranger stumbled onto her on the street, they probably wouldn't be able to do that. So it does seem like there's a little bit, the implication was that she was mute. She did not communicate verbally. But I found that I don't know if that was 100% true. It seems like she was able to communicate to a certain level, but still struggled a lot with verbal communication. But I don't think she was just completely non-communicative. And the area that they were living in, it's still a fairly rural area today. You go few enough miles east of Salem, and there's some highways, there's some back roads, and then there's Silver Falls, and it's kind of this big park space out there. And you can go out there and walk the trails and all that stuff. But still to this day, there's not a whole lot of people actually living out there. So there wouldn't have really been a lot of people living out there back then. And as I understand it, the McCullough family lived in what was described as, which makes sense, fairly temporary housing. They kind of lived in just kind of a simple shack cabin type setup. And they lived near a store in the area, and I think that was like the only real commercial space. So the only other space that people might go to that was there actually would be people there in close proximity to where the McCullough family lived. And this brings us to June 21st, 1941. Now, some of the McCullough family got up bright and early, went out and started doing their work. And it's still fairly early in the day, roughly around 8 a.m., maybe just a little bit after 8 a.m. And reportedly, Betty is still asleep inside the home with some of her sisters. And this is where, again, the information kind of is a little questionable, in my opinion, because it's stated like this is known information, but I feel more like it's inferred based on the circumstances. It's probably still what happened, but you can't say for absolute certainty, because the attitude is that Betty woke up, she took a water bucket that they had, and there was a water pump really close to their cabin. And the idea was that she was going to just take this water bucket down, fill it with water, and presumably bring it back. Whatever the circumstances were that brought about her deciding to do that. Maybe that's just something she did in the morning. That was one of her chores. Because considering her condition, I don't think she worked all that much as opposed to the rest of the family. and she slipped on a pair of her sister's shoes and then just walked out of the house. Now, all of that information, her picking up the pail, having an objective to go down to this water pump to get some water, that's information that's been inferred based on the fact that she had other sisters in the home with her. However, as it's also been reported, these sisters were asleep when this happened. So again, there was really no actual witnesses who saw with their eyes. And I found no information that suggested where the family was working was within eyesight of the cabin, or that anybody that had gotten up earlier from the family and was out working saw Betty leave, saw her with the water can, bucket, whatever you want to call it, walking off in the direction of the water pump. So I think the fact that the sister's shoes were missing, the water bucket was missing later on, they just kind of put two and two together and said that's what happened. And again, it seems logical that that is what happened. I don't think anybody came into the house and grabbed Betty and her sisters wouldn't hear anything. Again, they lived in this tiny little house. But once Betty walked out of their home with that water bucket, she vanished forever. She's never been seen since. So the sisters wake up, see that she's gone. She hasn't come back. She's missing for a long time when she left and did a task that shouldn't have taken that long. This, again, water pump was really close to where they lived. And anybody that would have perhaps snatched her from there, they would have had to get really close to the home to do it. It would have had to have been a fairly risky abduction. And it's hard to say. The truth of the situation is that because of where they lived, because it was so rural, it is the kind of terrain that criminals of various types, that might be the kind of place they would run to go and hide, kind of get off the radar for a little while. So could some weirdo have been hiding in the woods and they're, skulking around in there, and they come out in this general area and they see this little girl just with her little bucket, and they, it's a little 10-year-old girl, and they charge in. They either don't care whether they're seen or the circumstances of the moment. They look around and nobody else is around, and they snatch her for whatever reason. We don't know if that happened because, again, she's never been found. But it is interesting that it appears that she was planning to walk just a very short distance. Now, that being said, the information, again, was that the family lived in this little tiny home right across the street from this store. So it implies that there was a road right there. I'm not sure what that road was, if that road still exists today. I tried to look up the location of the store in question because they actually gave the name of the store. But in the limited information that was available, all I could find was that, it was like in the Silver Falls area. I'm like, well, it doesn't really help me that much. But again, it is known that there was a road close by. So a search ensues, and it's actually a very extensive search of the area. And of course, it's just a lot of rural area, lots of forested stretches, lots of places that are very difficult to get to, lots of places that searchers probably didn't even try to get to because it was too difficult. But it was reported that there was more than 40 hours of searching that went on in the first 2.5 days that Betty had gone missing. So people really put in the effort searching the vast area surrounding where the McCullough family lived. And they had no luck in that case. So any theory that would suggest that for whatever reason she walked away with the water bucket, she either didn't get water or she wandered off further into the forest and she ended up just getting into a situation where she got stuck and died, or, maybe got attacked by a wild animal that could have been out there. That was pretty much brushed off the table because the whole vast area around there was searched and they found nothing. So, again, this is why I mentioned that there was a street right between their home and where this store was located, was because the theory quickly became, the primary working theory by police was that somebody came down probably that road that I'm assuming would have also been in close proximity to the water pump, since that was close to their home, someone came down the street, saw her, and grabbed her, either with nefarious purposes or perfectly innocent ones. Meaning, somebody could have pulled up, seen a little girl by herself, and thought, let's grab her, and they grab her, and they disappear with her. Maybe they're grabbing her with the intent of holding her for ransom, or something much more troubling and difficult to think about. The other angle of it is somebody's driving along and they see this girl wandering, and they don't connect that she lives nearby with her family because, her sisters are inside sleeping and the rest of her family's gone. So perceivably, there's just this little girl walking around with a pail. And, it's a kind of a rural area, and I could see somebody pulling over and stopping and say, thinking, oh, this could be like a lost kid. I need to help this child. And those circumstances lead to them putting her into their car. Now, the question then is, well, if the person that took her under those circumstances was doing it innocently and actually wanted to help this child, how did she end up disappearing? Wouldn't this person drive around the area and see if they could find any homes and ask them, hey, is this your little girl? If they can't figure anything out, wouldn't they contact the police, contact somebody that would be in charge of dealing with lost children? And then Betty would be put in the care of them to hopefully be reunited with their children. She wouldn't just go missing. So that alone, that again, I'm going to get back to this later and express why I actually think this may have been what happened, is somebody picked her up with perfectly innocent motives. But looking at it, from a simple novice perspective, you'd think if somebody picked her up with good intentions, how would she still end up disappearing? And here's the thing. Whether it was a good person or a bad person that chose to pick her up, again, Betty struggled with communication. And actually, later on, shortly after she died, and this kind of gets back to what I was discussing earlier in relation to her struggles with communicating and how it was printed a lot that she was mute, that she just didn't communicate. But her family came out and expressed, and this is actually a quote from a local newspaper, her family stated that she was unable to speak well enough to make herself understood by strangers. So whether the person that might have picked her up had good intentions or bad intentions, odds are, if they tried to communicate with her, hey, what's your name? Why are you here? Where's your family? All those questions to try to figure out what's going on with this child, she probably would not be able to express herself in a way that they would understand and realize, oh, she lives here. Her house is right up there. So that I think could be a pretty significant factor in why, again, if somebody who had genuinely good motives to try to help this child, that might be part of the reason why she wasn't quickly reunited with her family, was the fact that she wouldn't be able to communicate that. And whoever picked her up wouldn't really know anything about her life, anything about who she was. And the fact that they were kind of a transient family and didn't really put down roots consistently anywhere, it would not surprise me under those circumstances, and it's during that time. We're going back, this is more than 80 years ago. It wouldn't surprise me if her family didn't have a whole lot of documentation. So it could be possible that, even if somebody picked her up, took her to local law enforcement, was like, I found this child, that they might even have difficulty determining who she was. She wouldn't be able to communicate to them who she was. She wouldn't have any actual documentation on her person, being a little 10-year-old kid just going out to get some water. Her family is new to the area and aren't lifelong Oregonians. And in fact, not too far down the road, they're probably going to be leaving again to find work elsewhere. So this is not a family that's firmly established in the area. And I could totally see anybody that Betty was taken to struggling to actually figure out who she was, where she lived, and where her family was. And in those early days, again, where there was actually an extensive search going on and the whole area was being examined. During that time, it was also noted, and this was actually expressed not initially by law enforcement, but by one of Betty's sisters. Her sister, Helen, expressed that they checked that water pump and saw that, like, water hadn't been drawn from it that morning. And the bucket was gone. Anything that Betty might have had on her person was gone. But the fact that no water had been drawn clearly indicated that she never actually, if she even made it to the pump, she never had an opportunity to actually draw water from it. So either somebody grabbed her at that point or possibly lured her away at that point. So that is of interest. It shows that she was probably taken not too long after she walked out of the house, within moments. And I know, people can say like, oh, well, she had a developmental disability. Maybe she just like wandered off and didn't know what was going on. And I think that's a little, there's no evidence for that. She probably would have been found somewhere in the woods later on. I feel like that's an easy presumption to reach by someone who has very tainted, biased, or has an uneducated opinion about of developmental disabilities. I'm certainly not a master in that field, but, I still see people all the time nowadays that'll say like, oh, well, they were disabled, so they could have done anything. And my head sinks into my hand, literally, when I think about that. And that's actually really nice, is that, and I'm gonna be getting to this, is that a lot of people have, now unfortunately again the information is so meek, but a lot of people have tried to, based on what little information is there, at least suggest possible conditions that Betty may have had. Not saying, oh, well, she absolutely had this, because that's irresponsible, but to say, based on what we know, this may have been her condition, that may have been her condition. And of course, another theory that has to be addressed, it always has to, and I want to kind of address it and then kind of sweep it away pretty quickly, because I do not think this was the case at all, is, when you're a little girl and you're living with your family and you suddenly disappear, you have to address the possibility. Was somebody in her family responsible for her disappearance? Did someone accidentally hurt her in a way that killed her and the family had to get rid of the body? Was maybe somebody in the family not so nice, to put it lightly? And, is it possible that because Betty had more needs than the rest, that could have become frustrating to somebody, especially somebody back in the 40s, where, again, disabilities are considerably less understood, and a lot of people are just like, they would just be like, okay, well, my kid is one of these people, so throw them in an asylum, throw them into a hospital, throw them somewhere where I don't have to take care of them. There was, again, nowadays there's a lot of people that treat their own children who have disabilities horribly. Back in the 40s, a lot of families would want to abandon their children. Again, we're not that far removed from the heyday of the eugenics movement, where literally the attitude was, if we decide somebody has a disability, we're just going to sterilize them so they can't spread their seed. But I do not think that is what happened in this case. There's no indicating factors that this family looked upon Betty with anything but love and support. And, you can even see it in their family, there's like one family picture of them, which is very interesting considering the fact that Betty would ultimately disappear. But there's one particular picture where the family is all standing together and Betty's kind of a little closer to the camera, but a little kind of off on her own. But still, there's no indication that this family looked upon Betty with anything but love. And in fact, Many, many years later, in the early 90s, a woman named Lena Taylor, who was actually, as I read it, the niece of Betty McCullough, which when a kid disappears so young, in your mind, you visualize them as being that age forever. Like, I watched a thing about JonBenet Ramsey recently, and I realized, like, if she was still alive, she would be just a few years younger than me. Or actually, she'd be about the same age as me. But to me, she's, like, always going to be, like, 6 years old. So it's weird to see somebody referenced as the niece of someone who was last seen when they were only 10 years old. But Lena wanted to start looking into this disappearance more. And one of the things she noted that was a lot of the family that was still living, and of course this is about 50 years later, so a lot of Betty's sisters or siblings would have been like in their 60s by this point. And she expressed that even by then, a lot of people in the family, they didn't really want to talk about it because they were just so heartbroken by the fact that this little girl just disappeared. They don't know what happened to her. And you can only hope that she didn't meet a horrible death. The fact that, that many years, several decades down the road, and this family was still so crestfallen over the loss of this girl really shows how much they cared about her and were crushed. This permanently altered their family. And what was so sad was, as transient workers, it would, again, probably not too far down the line after Betty went missing, and she's still missing. Nobody knows where she is. She's probably in Oregon somewhere. The family would have to pretty much pack up and move to a new place. I don't know where they would have moved to next or really what happened to the family later on after Betty's disappearance, but as a migrant working family, they would have to continue doing that to make ends meet, and they would have literally had to pack up and relocate to some other part of the country, and to a degree, kind of leave Betty behind, at least in a physical sense or a geographical sense. And that had to be very difficult on the family. So I don't think for a second that someone in her family killed her off, despite the information one could employ, like, oh, she was last seen really close to where she lived. Her family claims, that they don't know what happened to her. She never even made it to the water pump, so somebody nearby probably grabbed her. Like, you can throw all that around and theorize about that all you want, but it's not going to bring you to any solid conclusions. And yeah, so that clearly indicates that, obviously it's the oldest missing persons case on the Doe Network, so obviously Betty McCullough is still never found and unlikely to ever be found since she's been missing for over 80 years now. But I do, before transitioning into at least a possible theory I have as to what happened and kind of the reasons, I'm going to address the reasons why it maybe didn't happen, but also reasons why I think it could have happened. It's kind of rare because usually when I cover cases like this, I'll address other theories that were already established, and I might kind of throw around some of my own, but I don't really have any strong ones. You're dealing with a lot of cases where people turn up dead and there's no real evidence. They may not even be found at the crime scene where they were actually killed. When people go missing, and they haven't been found, you have no idea where they are, so you don't know whether they're up on a mountain, they're drowned at sea, you don't know. So there's a lot of instances where you're throwing ideas around, but they're all very vague because you don't really have any answers. And of course, Betty McCullough, we have no idea what happened to her, but I have a theory that I think is pretty strong and might possibly explain what happened to her. I will never say, like, I genuinely think this is what happened. This is just, I think, a strong theory, and it coincides with the whole idea that someone may have been going down that street, seen her, and picked her up. But before I go there, I just want to make mention of some of the ideas that people have had about what type of condition Betty McCullough may have had in her life. Because again, a lot of people have tried to kind of look at that angle to maybe better try to understand her disability, because back in the 40s, it's so vague what they have to say. And some people have contemplated if she may have had autism. And I know I saw some information from, I believe it was the National Autistic Society, expressed that there's a much higher prevalence of autism in people who are deaf than people who aren't. And that that may possibly be what she had. And at the time, autism was, I don't even know if it was recognized yet at that time. And beyond that, I'm gonna actually pull up, because there was two possible syndromes that people suggested she may have had, and one of those was a syndrome known as Freeman-Sheldon syndrome, which I looked up information off of rarediseases.org, because all of these diseases suggested are all extremely rare. But Freeman-Sheldon syndrome is described as a exceptionally rare disease or rare disorder present before birth that primarily affects muscles of the face and skull, but frequently involves problems with joints of the hands and feet. So I think this got people's attention a lot because in pictures you see of Betty, she appears smaller and younger than a child of 10. She almost looks more like a child who's like 7, 8 years old. As far as signs and symptoms of this particular disorder, people that have it often have very small mouths, a whistling face appearance, or pursed lips, which I did notice in some pictures of Betty, the few that exist. She does appear to have kind of a pursed mouth thing happening. And that's just a few of the possible symptoms that one could have. And they also tend to have restricted joint movements, which based on pictures alone of Betty, we can't really ascertain how good or bad her mobility is. That's something we just don't know. And yeah, it seems like a lot of the issues that one can experience in relation to this syndrome tend to happen around the mouth. There's suggestions that someone with it could have swallowing issues, difficulty eating, and just lots of issues in terms of the structure of their mouth and obviously the size within, thus making, eating perhaps a little bit more difficult. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate to communication problems. However, it has been suggested that one could develop difficulties communicating or speech problems, which in part could come as a result of just the insides of your mouth and the general makeup of your skull not being structured properly, just making things not function right. But it has been suggested that dysphagia is something that could happen with someone that has this symptom, and it's possible that someone could develop issues speaking and even being coherent with talking and just, general issues communicating altogether, which leads me back to think about her parents and how they said she's not a mute. Like, we can understand her. We've developed a way that we can understand the way that she communicates, but her communication skills are so poor that a stranger who's not used to how she communicates would not be able to communicate with her. So there's definite possibilities here that suggest maybe this is something that Betty could have been dealing with. The other one that I think I saw a little bit more, at least a few more people suggesting as a likely possibility, was something described as Rubinstein-Taybi syndrome, which is another rare disorder that affects a lot of the organs in your body and is characterized by a delay in growth, which again, Betty McCullough seemed to be not quite developed to the age of somebody who was 10 years old in terms of her physical appearance. She did almost look like she was having a delay in her physical development. And there'd be distinctive facial features and intellectual disabilities has been suggested. It says on rarediseases.org that an average IQ of somebody with this issue would be an IQ of only 36 to 51 for an IQ, which is very, very disabled intellectually. Even someone with an IQ in the 60s or 70s would can be considered at least mildly disabled or have a mild learning disability of some kind. So to have an IQ no greater than around 50, this could possibly explain some of Betty's complications, the fact that she struggled horribly with communication. And dysphagia has also been suggested as a possible symptom of this syndrome as well, which could just add to the difficulties of not just communicating, but having difficulty breathing properly and eating food properly without complications. It also can potentially have create issues in terms of your physical appearance, as I mentioned before, but also like skull development. There's a lot of similarities between these two possible syndromes, which might explain why multiple people have suggested them as possibilities. And there's also, again, suggestions that there can be growth delays, speech delays, intellectual disabilities. But because it affects the organs, some people that have it, some of your most important organs, your heart, and your respiratory system and things like this can be drastically affected. And the fact that your respiratory system can be drastically affected might explain why Betty McCullough got sick so easily and would get sick all the time. Obviously, I've known people that get sick all the time simply because they just have a weak respiratory system. But in this case, there might be a possible connection there. So you can see some of the reasons why people might suggest that somebody in Betty's condition might have one of these. And I did notice, I never saw this mentioned in any information, but there was another syndrome that was mentioned as a related disorder to these that I previously mentioned, and that was called floating harbor syndrome, which can appear very similar in terms of the symptoms to these previous ones I've mentioned. The syndrome is characterized by unique facial features, a low birth weight, probably slower like physical development, a short stature, bone age delay, and there could also be, I noticed they wrote, there may also be severe language impairments. So not saying someone is incapable of communicating, but that they might struggle greatly with communicating. And then there's mention of other things that are really impossible to determine whether they affected Betty or not. I noticed that pretty much all of these syndromes mention like joint issues, hand and feet, abnormalities in terms of how they form and grow. So these are all possibilities considering the circumstances of these syndromes and what little we know about Betty McCullough. The important thing to remember here is that these are all not just rare disorders, these are extremely rare. So it's easy to throw around like, oh, well, so-and-so had this, I do that all the time when I have an ailment popping up and I don't know what it is, and I try to put the pieces together, and then right when I think I figured it out, I go see the doctor and it ends up being something completely different. So by no means can we say that she had one of these syndromes, but these are the possible things that have been suggested maybe Betty McCullough was suffering with, and that led to the various struggles that she had. I think it's a pretty strong likelihood that she was on the spectrum. Again, considering a multitude of different things. Potentially her being deaf or her difficulty struggling communicating, but I also noticed in a lot of the photographs taken of her, she doesn't appear to even really be aware that she's being photographed. She definitely had, I definitely think she had some developmental disability or something along those lines. But again, I don't want to state for certain. I think it's this or that over that, because again, we're just theorizing. And the main reason I discuss it so much in this video is because it's something that a lot of people have discussed who have tried to look into it on message boards and things like that, and trying so hard to understand what she may have been struggling with. Because for all we know, while it's a long shot, if it could somehow be figured out exactly what she was struggling with, which I really don't think we're ever going to do, but if somehow, if that was possible, it might provide a better explanation, or a direction to go into in terms of trying to understand what happened to her the day she disappeared. Would it have been potentially likely that she wandered off in this direction? Would she maybe have been like things that you wouldn't think of, that I don't even think really happened? Like, could she have run away? Or just, it would narrow down the field potentially in terms of trying to understand what may have happened to her. And if someone did pick her up, how would she react to that? Things of that nature. Because right now we just have a few details, and some of those are hazy. But I do definitely think, it's a very strong likelihood that whatever the circumstances were, Betty McCullough disappeared because somebody picked her up, regardless of what their motives may have been. But the fact that such a vast area surrounding where she lived was searched for like pretty much 2.5 days straight. Granted, a lot of that terrain out there is difficult to traverse. Had she been killed, for example, near where she lived and thrown into an area that was overrun by plant life, almost impossible for someone to get to, and she just kind of blended in with the foliage, maybe she did die and her remains are lingering somewhere really close to where her family lived. But the fact of the matter is, no signs of her were found. The bucket wasn't found that she would have been taken to get water. There was just nothing discovered. So I think that she was probably grabbed and taken away. And as she was probably lured to a vehicle, she probably just kept the water bucket in her hands. And it's so sad, because I think of like this, a 10-year-old girl who's, potentially struggling with some disability, and someone pulls up and, tries to lure her into their car. And they could be doing this for horrible reasons, or at least with horrible motivations. And she, may not necessarily know whether this is the right thing or the wrong thing to do in that moment. And she just gets into the car and disappears forever. However, I just want to put this out there. This is my thought as to what maybe could have happened. Here was my course of action in terms of how I got to thinking of Betty McCullough and thinking that she could have ended up here. When I first saw the information in relation to Betty McCullough and saw that she had disappeared really close to where Silver Falls is, it immediately made me think of Janie Landers, who was, I believe she was 19 years old back in 1979. And she was a resident of the Fairview Training Center located towards the southern end of Salem. It's closed down now, but it opened in 1908, and I believe closed down in 2000, and had a pretty checkered history. I think it got a little better in its final decades, but it had such a shameful past that it was pretty much forcibly closed in 2000. And there was, to prevent overcrowding, they would sterilize people and then sometimes send them out. Like, okay, you can go back out in public now and it's fine because you can't procreate. Eugenics was, of course, huge back then, and a lot of people that worked in places like Fairview thought that that was essential, that it prevented the human species from degrading in some way, or just something stupid like that. But I thought of Janie Landers, who disappeared from Fairview Training Center, and she was she had a developmental disability. I believe she was at the like intellectual development of like an 18-year or an 8-year old. And she was lured away from the, I believe it was probably the laundry building there, which is interesting because the only time I ever visited the Fairview Training Center was several years ago. And the only building I checked out was a building that I later found out was that laundry building. When I went in there at the time, I didn't know what it was for. It was just, you walk in and you turn and there's this big room there, and that was the laundry facility. Because the individual that lured her away worked at Fairview, and he worked primarily in that area. So it's likely that Janie was lured away from that particular building, and this guy lured her away, got her off the campus, and then just brutally assaulted and killed her. And he left her really close to Silver Falls. It was in that exact same area where Betty McCullough went missing almost 40 years earlier. And of course, this guy that abducted Janie Landers eventually got fired for behaving inappropriately around some of the people that were living there. And it was a cold case for many, many years. It was only a couple years ago that they finally busted the guy on that murder. But hearing about Betty McCullough disappearing from near Silver Falls immediately made me think of Janie Landers. And that made me think of the Fairview Training Center. And I thought, okay, what if somebody, again, is driving down the road that was probably between the McCullough home and this store, and they see Betty there walking with her water bucket, and, you know, she was kind of, someone could see her from, especially in the 1940s when people were real quick to pass judgment on how people appeared. Not that that's gone away entirely today, but I could totally see someone seeing Betty McCullough and pulling to the side of the road and thinking, you know, she's probably potentially a lost kid. And it's kind of a rural area. They might not necessarily think there's a big family living close by. So they pick her up with the intention of trying to figure out who she is, who she lives with. So they get out and they try to talk to her. And again, they can't communicate with her because her communication skills were, she struggled so much communicating that a stranger would not be able to communicate with her. So she wouldn't be able to tell whoever stopped, like, oh no, it's fine, I live here. My family lives like right over there. I'm just getting some water. So when they would see, potentially see that she was deaf, but see that she struggled horribly with communicating, someone would probably pretty quickly think like, oh, they wouldn't think about it the way we do today, where we'd say like, this person may have a developmental disability of some kind. They would think of that, but in much less savory terms, with it being the 1940s. So they pick this girl up and they take her somewhere. I don't know if they take her to the police or where exactly, but they're probably thinking this is like this is a disabled person. Would it be possible that they would drive her straight to Fairview, which is in Salem? I think it's only about 20 miles or so from the general area where Betty's family lived. And here's the only real strong argument I found against this possibly being the case, is that pretty much all of the people that were at Fairview, now granted, a lot of them were very young people for the most part. So Betty, being a little 10-year-old girl, she would have fit in quite well as far as ages go. But pretty much everybody that resided at the Fairview Training Center, was put there by their family, and those families had to pay Fairview to take care of their child. So that was pretty important to Fairview. If you want us to watch over your kid and take care of them and give them housing and feed them and try to educate them the best they can so that you don't have to do all that stuff, you have to pay us to do that. So it seems unlikely that they would just, someone would show up with a random little girl that they don't know who she is, and that they would just be like, oh yeah, she's probably from here. Now they might have done that. I don't know, but that's really the only strongest argument I saw against them possibly bringing Betty to Fairview and then her just staying at Fairview, possibly. Now, here's another important thing to understand is during the 30s and into the 1940s, was probably the time of greatest instability at the Fairview Training Center. They were getting overcrowded, and just the general structure of the establishment was it was just becoming a big mess, and it kind of needed to be reorganized. And the 1940s are considered the time of greatest instability at Fairview, and this is 1941. So could she have, been just slipped in and become part of that environment at Fairview, and through all the chaos, she just slipped in there, and she's just another kid there. And again, we have to remember this is the 1940s. There is no social media. You can't just you can't take a picture of the girl with your phone, post her online, and say, does anybody recognize this child? And if you do, people will go on Reddit and be like, oh, well, if you don't know who she is and she can't communicate, take her to this place, take her to that place, and all that stuff. This is just a random child that was picked up alongside the road. She struggles communicating. She's not going to have any, documentation on her. So as far as anybody knows, this is a random girl with no name. They don't know who she is, and because of that, they don't know where her family is. But I could totally see someone picking up a kid who looked disabled and immediately taking them to Fairview. And one of the reasons I believe that, aside from the fact that Fairview was so close, is the fact that something that was always an issue at Fairview, it was an issue in its early years, it was an issue in the middle 20th century, it was an issue in the 70s, was people were constantly running away from there. It was almost a daily thing. There would be, it was constant. I know some years, for just 1 year, they would have more than 100 runaways. It was constant, and a lot of these kids would often get tracked down in close proximity, the 10, 20, 30-mile space surrounding Fairview Training Center, because a lot of them, once they get away from the campus, they might not know how to contact their parents. They might not know how to get to their parents. So they're just kind of running away. So odds are, if they're going to get apprehended, they're going to get apprehended fairly close to Fairview. And here's this girl that's found wandering around in the woods only about 15, 20 miles from Fairview. A random citizen living in the area that knows Fairview and knows that kids would be running away from there all the time might see Betty and immediately think, I bet you this is a Fairview runaway. So I definitely think it's possible that she could have ended up there. And her family, who probably wasn't living in the area that long, and even if they were, they didn't know the area well, probably wouldn't even know that the Fairview Training Center was around. And even if they did at least know of Fairview's existence, they wouldn't necessarily think to immediately go there to look for her. I mean, especially, again, kind of the main theory that was going on was that somebody probably bad had picked up Betty and abducted her and taken her somewhere else, God only knows, and probably killed her, considering the fact that she hasn't been seen in over 80 years. So Fairview is a possible place that Betty stayed at for a fairly lengthy period. She could have been right up the street, and her family may have not even known about it. And again, if her family's a transient family, before too long, maybe even just a few weeks down the road, they have probably, I would assume, again, I don't know exactly what happened to her family afterwards, but they are still a migrant family that has to go where the work is to support themselves, to put food in their children's mouths. So it's likely that not long after Betty disappeared, her family pretty much had to leave the area to pursue work wherever they pursued it next. And I don't know if they ever really came back to the Oregon area that long afterwards, but for all we know, Betty could have ended up at Fairview. And here's another thing, is she wouldn't have necessarily had to end up there immediately. Someone could have seen her, picked her up, seen that she appeared to have a disability of some kind, and they could have taken her to the state hospital, which is also in Salem. And a lot of children who were originally put at kind of the state hospital, a lot of them would eventually just get moved over to Fairview anyway. In fact, I think the first person ever admitted at Fairview was a little boy who had been moved over there from the state hospital, and then a bunch of other kids moved over there afterwards. So, Betty, again, with them still, and who's to say if they ever even established an identity for her? And back during this time, if it's just a random kid who, appears to have a disability, and they obviously weren't super sensitive to these people since they were sterilizing a lot of them and deeming them blights to humanity in some cases, some real dark, disgusting stuff. Would they have tried all that hard? If they tried looking and couldn't figure it out, would they have really tried that hard to figure out exactly who Betty was? Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't have. And if her family leaves not long after, even if they put the word out after a little while around the Salem area, if her family's gone by then, they're not going to know that, and they're not going to be, they're not going to see, notices that go out and say, like, hey, we have a child here that somebody found. We don't know who she is or who her family is. I don't know. I just know that even if she had gotten taken to the state hospital as opposed to Fairview, odds are she would have eventually potentially been relocated from the state hospital to Fairview anyway. And again, it was so shook up during that time at Fairview. She could have been one of these kids that they just took in because they didn't know who her parents were, they didn't know where she belonged, and there was nowhere else to really put her. And if, the doctor that saw her was right, I question it, but if somehow the doctor that saw her that said she probably wouldn't live beyond her late teens, if that doctor was accurate, it's entirely possible she could have stayed at Fairview a few years and passed away. There were a lot of people that lived at Fairview that passed away young, some of which may have possibly passed away under suspicious circumstances or due to abuses by the staff there. But, Betty McCullough could have been there a few years and then passed away. And, there's nobody to claim her because her family doesn't know she's there. And she eventually just is taken somewhere, buried somewhere, I don't know where. On like a poor farm or something like that. I wouldn't know. Obviously I can't say that is what happened in this case. I just think there's very strong circumstantial evidence to suggest an alternative to the standard story, which is a kid went missing. Obviously some freak picked them up, took them somewhere, probably killed them, and then hid them somewhere. And it's just a spot that hasn't been searched, and that's why we haven't found her all these years. That's obviously, could have happened. A lot of times when kids go missing and they're not runaways, and there's nothing to suggest they left on their own under other circumstances, odds are someone else is responsible for the reason they disappeared. I'm certainly not saying that couldn't have happened. I know that's kind of the theory that has held over time. I just wanted to present this as a possible alternative because I absolutely think it could have happened. And I noticed it doesn't seem to be something that there's not a whole lot of information about this, but when I would go through forums and threads and people discussing this, I didn't see anybody suggest that possibility. And they would have been right here, and Fairview would have been right here. So I just wanted to put that out there as a possible theory. And when all is said and done, the fact of the matter is we have no clue what happened to this girl. But the fact, again, that she disappeared so close to where she lived, as it seems like she disappeared from pretty much right on the land her family was living on. I'd bet money that she was taken by someone. So it's really interesting that there's so much to reflect on and so much to contemplate and so much to wonder about. I think even though this is still a fairly obscure case, when it gets posted about on forums, people take notice and people take interest. This was a girl who perceivably struggled with absolutely physical, but possibly also mental struggles and disabilities. And then she just, disappeared so young, separated from her family, who, again, years and years, decades later, were still crushed by her death. It's wild to think this is a story about a little girl who wakes up, takes her little water pail. She's just going to go get some water. And then she leaves and doesn't come back. And that's really all there is to it in terms of what we actually know to be true, is She left the house and never came back. And yet there's so much to think about and still reflect on in the case. And under the circumstances, I hope it's solved one day, but so many years have gone by, and especially if she is still out there, kind of in the woods, around the Silver Lake, or not Silver Lake, but Silver Falls area. And, it's possible over time, erosion of the land, landslides, things like that could have, buried her remains. Her remains could be left in an area that's practically inaccessible by people. It could have been left in an area where an animal could have gotten to the remains. There's so many circumstances wherein if she was potentially taken and killed near where she lived and deposited like that there's no way we would ever find her. And of course, if she was picked up by somebody and taken to Fairview, if they never fully identified her, even when she died, and they probably wouldn't have put a lot of time into trying to figure out who she was even after she died. So she would have been right there in front of our eyes and we wouldn't have even known. There is a 1959 film that was done that chronicled what was going on at the Fairview Training Center. Obviously with a very positive spin on things, not addressing the more darker things that were going on there. And I actually went through it real quick because it was put out about 18 years after Betty McCullough disappeared. I figured on a lark I would just watch it and try to see if I could find somebody that looked not necessarily 28, because that's how old Betty would have been, but if her physical development was slower, pretty much somebody at least anywhere between the ages of 20 and 28 who at least bore some kind of a resemblance to what she looked like as a kid. And honestly, there's so many clips that show so many people in one area, and it's old grainy black and white footage. I didn't go in expecting to find anything, but as far as I could see, I didn't really see anybody in the video that looked like her. But I figured I might as well go through and see if there's somebody that somehow looked exactly like her. And maybe that's a discovery, maybe it's not, maybe it's just somebody that looked like her. And then the other alternative is someone picks her up and takes her really far away, and you'd think probably killed her off and left her somewhere, but it's really far away from where she lived. It's not a place that people would think to look. And again, if her parents leave the area, it becomes even less likely that her remains would ever be found. But you can never say never. It happens sometimes. Someone will disappear 100 years ago and some bones get found. Some house gets torn down and they have to dig up the ground to put in a new foundation, and you find bones. Story I covered from 1920, it was 1921, in a video I did about a dance hall when they decided to do some work on this dance hall up in the Albina part of Portland. And when they went underneath the building and were trying to dig a hole to jack up the building to reinforce it, they found bones, and they discovered the resolution to a girl who had disappeared from California like 7 years before. Sometimes the things you least expect show up in the strangest of places. So you can never say there's no chance that Betty McCullough will ever be found, but considering the time that's passed, the lack of any idea anybody has for certain as to where she could have ended up, where she was when she died, how much longer she lived before she died, we don't have a victim, we don't have a crime scene, we don't have a suspect, we have nothing. We don't even know for absolute certain that she was abducted. If by chance she did kind of wander off, even just for fun, wandered off into the woods and slipped and fell into, down a hill into a space that people couldn't get to, and she struggles with communication and can't just scream out for help. You can't 100% rule out that. I don't think that's what happened, but it's just the fact of the matter is we just don't know what happened. We don't have the slightest idea exactly what could have happened to this little girl, and that's so tragic and unfortunate that this girl had a decade of life and then just vanished forever. And that is, as far as I can tell it, the most of the story about the disappearance, and I would think potentially murder, case of Betty McCullough from Sulphur Falls area near Salem back in the summer of 1941. And I hope they find her someday and they can get DNA. You know, it would be just skeletal remains, but you get some DNA and maybe you get lucky. All that said, I'd like to thank you so much for stopping by. If you like what you see, you want to help my channel grow, help support it, give the video a like. Share it around if you so choose, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff helps me out. I also have a Patreon as well if you want to help me out that way. The link to that is in the description with this video. Thank you in advance if you choose to join up with me there. I have lots of extra stuff that is only available if you go there now. Hours of extra video I've shot that doesn't go on my main channel. And in addition to that link, there's also a link to my Facebook, Instagram, Reddit subreddit, and my TikTok. So all that said, thank you one more time for stopping by, watching today's video. And till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.